Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Games. Today we're going to be diving back into Marvel Champions living card game. We're going to talk about the new hero pack Spider-Ham. First up, we're going to talk about the alter ego side of this card. It's going to be Peter Porker. One thing you should notice is that there is a massive recovery value of 5. That's something that's kind of uncommon in this game. It allows you to recover extremely fast with this character. You have a decent number of hit points at 12. It's a little bit above the average. Traditional hand size of 6 for your alter ego. What's really going to be driving this character is the concept of tune counters. So this alter ego's special ability is response. After you make a basic recovery, place 1 tune counter on Peter Porker. So by just simply recovering, you can place a tune counter on this character. You're going to see that tune counters will power this deck quite nicely. Probably the best thing that you can use for these tokens is going to be using them as generic resources, and I'll show you kind of what that looks like. I think ramping on this character is pretty fast, and the reason why is that these tune counters that we were talking about before, you can simply spend them as if they were a wild resource. That gives you a very quick way to put cards out onto the table. One thing that you should notice is that when you have access to so many resources, it's a really great opportunity for you to put permanent cards into play, whether that's allies or supports or upgrades. This character really shines when you're putting permanent things into play because you can bring them out pretty fast and you can amass a wild amount of stuff on the table very, very quickly. Next up, we have a response. And this is going to be after Spider-Ham takes any amount of damage, place 1 tune counter on this character. This is pretty wild. So, and this is any amount of damage. So if, let's say a minion hits him or the villain hits him, you're going to be building up these tokens and these counters really fast. It builds so quickly that you're able to really power your deck with your resources. And I think one place that this character really shines is with the leadership aspect. If you can bring out a ton of pretty cheap, allies in the 2 to 3 resource range, you can bring out a lot of them and build up a pretty sizable army. And you can really sustain those 3 allies over the course of the game. So it was really common to have 2 or 3 allies out the entire game because you have so many resources. So definitely think about building permanence with this character by use of these tune counters. Next, we're going to talk about Spider-Ham's upgrades. We have the wooden hammer, and then we also have the organic webbing. And these are kind of very similar cards. They both cost 2 resources. One of them is going to permanently increase his attack ability by +1, and the other one's going to raise his thwart by +1. That's going to be the webbing. Now, what you can do with these 2 weapons, you can just simply use them to augment your basic ability scores, or what you can do is you can start spending some of your tune counters on these. I didn't find these upgrades as impactful as spending the tune counters for resources, but you can still use them. So in this case, you can remove a tune counter, and Spider-Ham gets a +2 attack for that attack, and the attack gains overkill. That's actually, fairly decent, especially if you need to use an overkill sort of ability to wipe out a minion and then hit the villain. And then the one on the right-hand side is that you can spend the tune counter and you can ready Spider-Ham and he will gain the aerial trait until the end of the phase. That is, that's pretty decent. It's better that you're readying Spider-Ham so you can use him for some other action. The aerial trait, you can use that if you like using aerial cards. I didn't tend to want to build an aerial deck with Spider-Ham simply because I was focusing on all of these tune counters and wanting to spend them as resources. Next, I'm going to talk about 2 other cards. The first one is Petulant Pig on the left-hand side of the screen. And this one, I was kind of hesitant to use it, but I have to admit that in conjunction with Spider-Ham's ability to get a tune counter every time you take damage, I think it actually works pretty well with this deck, and I wasn't hesitant to use this card at all. You get to draw 3 cards, but the villain attacks you. But also remember, too, you're going to get that free, kind of that tune counter that you can use as a resource. And then the card on the right, I would often use with Petulant Pig, and this is Cartoon Physics. When your identity would take any amount of damage, discard this card, and then you prevent all but 1 of that damage. So it's kind of nice. You have the villain attack you, then you play this other card and basically reduce the damage down to 1. Now you're still getting hit for a point of damage, so then you can put the tune counter still on Spider-Ham. So I really liked both these cards. I thought they were pretty easy to use, and I thought they synergized well together. Next up, every hero deck has some basic thwarting and attack cards, and this deck is no different. So the card on the left is Ham It Up, and there's 2 copies of this in the hero cards. It says remove 1 threat from a scheme for each tune counter on Spider-Ham. And this can vary quite a bit. I would say on average, we were probably seeing this to be about 3. So we typically had about 3 tune counters off to the side when we played this card. There was one case where we had 7, and that was a pretty awesome thwarting event. I would say, though, on average, you're going to be looking at about 3, but for 3 threat reduction for 0 cost event, I think that's pretty cost effective. Then the card on the right is basically a swinging web kick. And this is going to deal 6 damage to an enemy, and it also confuses the enemy. So it does cost 3, but I think the key to this is that you can confuse the enemy as well. It's pretty decent that you have a 5 recovery with this character, so you don't really have to necessarily fear going into your alter ego form to heal, specifically because you do have a 5 recovery. So I kind of felt that it was a good combo to hit the enemy with Swinging Web Pig just prior to going into my alter ego form. And then that way I don't have to take any sort of threat if the villain schemes against me. When you're playing this deck, definitely read the text on Hogwashed very carefully. Basically, what it allows you to do is take a tune counter off Spider-Ham, but it lets you do either 5 damage to a minion, and this is not the villain, just a minion, or remove 5 threat from a side scheme, and that's a side scheme, not the main scheme. So kind of when we were playing with this card, the players tended to kind of think, oh, hey, I can just hit anything for 5, or thwart basically anything for 5 and remove 5 threats from any scheme. It's a little bit more situational. I still think it's pretty good cost economy. And then the card of the right is I don't think so. And this is kind of like an encounter deck nullification card. You can use it to nullify the effects on the card as it comes out. A lot of these cards exist in this game. I think it's kind of right in alignment with all the other cards that you see typically in this game for this type of effect. Next up, we have just the final 2 permanent types of cards that are in the deck. I always like just showing everything. First one's Captain America. It's pretty decent. Once this card enters play, you can put a tune counter on your identity, and then you can shuffle a Spider-Ham card from your discard pile into your deck. It doesn't necessarily have to be an event. It can be any Spider-Ham card, so that's pretty versatile. And then the card on the right is the Daily Beagle. Exhaust the Daily Beagle and place 1 tune counter on Peter Porker. It's an alter ego action. In general, I felt that he's fairly resilient to damage, and I didn't spend a lot of time in alter ego form, so I think the card on the right is just a very typical type of alter ego card that you would see in this game. I want to kind of walk through, in my opinion, what is one of the biggest benefits of playing this character. I really felt that it meshed very well with a leadership style deck in which I had a ton of fairly cheap costing allies to bring into the game, and those would be in the 2 to 3 resource range. I really felt that Spider-Ham excelled at this sort of tactic. You can build up these tune counters really, really quickly, and what makes it fun is that you can put out a whole host of allies. And where this sort of synergy really takes off is that you use Spider-Ham, and when you're fighting, let's say, a minion and a villain, you let the minion hit Spider-Ham, and that allows you to build up these tokens very quickly, because anytime he takes damage, you get a tune counter. And then what you can do is you can use the heavy hits on your cheap allies that you're bringing out into the game to really reduce the amount of damage that Spider-Ham is taking, so you can keep him out on the board for a pretty long and hefty amount of time. So kind of think of it that way, as like Spider-Ham is fighting the minions, and your allies are basically blocking the villain. And it works really, really well, and to build up these counters really, really quickly, and then you just spend them on more and more allies. and you can just keep putting this whole host of just like endless blockers into play. I think it also resonates really well with newer players, especially if they want to have a little bit more simplistic character. I think the mechanic of the tune counter is very simple to understand, and I think that even your youngest players for Marvel Champions, this sort of strategy would be, somewhat easy for them to play. So I could see maybe even some elementary school kids actually playing a Spider Ham deck and being fairly successful at it. It's a fairly easy mechanic to understand. So what I'm going to do is just start putting some allies onto the table so you can get just a general sense of how many sort of cheap allies they are. And I kind of removed the ones with any sorts of trigger effects, like for Guardians or Champions or Avengers. These are more of your sort of generic style allies that you can play. So as you can see, there's a pretty wide variety and host of allies that you can throw into this deck. And then don't forget some of your gray colored cards as well, your basic cards. You can throw a bunch of those allies into the deck as well. So you can put together a pretty fast and easy deck for anybody to understand and play. Throw in 2 copies of the Power of Leadership. Makes it super easy to bring out all of these allies. The Power of Leadership will basically work with any sort of leadership card that you have. And if you want to keep the deck really, really simple, you can even keep most events out of the deck as well. Or if you want to, you can just put some of your ally recycling cards into this deck as well, and you can get just a ton of allies out. Let's talk about Justice real quick and the pre-made deck that comes with Spider-Ham. There is a card in here, and this is an older card. It comes in one of the other sets as well. It's called One Way or Another. I found that this card was really effective in conjunction with Petulant Pig. There were numerous times when we were playtesting specifically the Justice style cards in which a player started with one or both of these in their hand and just started playing and playing and playing and drawing a ridiculous amount of cards. And it kind of got to the point where it was just silly. It was just absolutely ridiculous. There were a ton of side schemes in play, and then the villain had attacked, Spider-Ham, once, or I think it was twice actually. But anyways, there were 3 of these cards that popped, so the player actually pulled 9 cards from the top of their deck. And it kind of just got ridiculous because there were so many just attack events and different things that the player could do that we just kept trying it over and over again. And this strategy really resonates quite well. So literally playing 3 copies of One Way or Another with Petulant Pig in the deck, and there's 2 copies of Petulant Pig in this set. Keep your eyes open for that when you're playing Justice. I thought it was absolutely just ridiculous, the amount of things that you could do. In conjunction with that, and this is also in the pre-made deck, there's this card called Even the Odds, and it allows you to remove 1 threat per player from each side scheme. And then you can deal 1 damage to the villain for each side scheme defeated in this way. We typically didn't wipe out a lot of side schemes, but after you draw just a ridiculous amount of cards and you put a ton of side schemes into play, you can kind of clean up the table pretty nicely with Even the Odds. So the pre-made deck, I think, works pretty well with the Justice aspect. And then this other card that they threw in is also new, and this is called Overwatch. And you can only attach 1 to a scheme, but when any amount of threat is removed from the attached scheme by a thwart, you can discard this card and then remove an equal amount of threat from a different scheme. So this, in conjunction with Even the Odds and having a ton of side schemes in play, made it just really satisfying and easy to eliminate threats and draw just a ridiculous amount of cards. I actually thought that this concept really wouldn't work, but game after game after game, we got this combo to work, numerous times, especially when you're drawing just a ridiculous number of cards. It's pretty easy to actually get it to work. So if you do like Justice, I think the pre-made deck turned out pretty well, and obviously you can remove, some of the cards that you don't necessarily like or use and then replace them with other Justice-style cards that you do enjoy. When playing Aggression, one of the players at the table sort of gravitated toward the idea of having a decent number of sort of like mid-cost, aggression events in the deck. And the reason why is that the player felt with the amount of resource tokens basically being generated from the tune counters that it was easy to bring out a lot of these cards, and that was absolutely correct. So the player was, basically using one of these a turn, and it was pretty easy, and it wasn't really that much of a resource strain or constraint. So one of the things that we found is that when you're playing Spider-Ham, you can bring out these events, and they're usually fairly costly, and you would maybe shy away from them. But with Spider-Ham having all those tune counters, you can absolutely play one of these almost every single turn and not really feel all that resource constrained. One thing I want to note, and one of the players at the table noticed this pretty quickly after our first game with using Penny Parker and Spider-Ham. The player made the comment, hey, what happens if you just took some of those basic, Penny Parker protection cards and threw them in the Spider-Ham deck instead? And they actually work decently well, and I'll kind of walk you through why that is. So Spider-Ham's special ability triggers if he takes any amount of damage. So it doesn't matter if it's 1 point or 5, Spider-Ham is going to get a tune counter. So what the person basically observed is that you can use Energy Barrier and the Force Field Generator to sort of soften the blow that the villain is giving your character, but you still take that 1 point of damage, and thus you get to build up these tune counters rather quickly on Spider-Ham. So, something quick that you can do is you can literally just throw 2 sets of 3 of these cards into the Spider-Ham deck, or any other card, and there's numerous ones that are protection oriented that decrease the overall attack of the villain. And if you can get it down to like a manageable 1 or 2 points every turn, Spider-Ham is absolutely amazing because you can just keep putting those tune counters out. And what's great about this card on the right is that it has 6 energy counters on it. It's a little bit hefty with a 3 casting cost, but what we found is that over and over again, since Spider-Ham was building up so many tokens, they could play down the Force Field Generator pretty often and really have one or both of these out at the same time to just soak up damage. So that's a pretty cool combo. So if you also bought the Penny Parker expansion, just throw these protection cards in, and Spider-Ham does a pretty good job. Alrighty, so hopefully you've had a decent time looking at some of these Spider-Ham strategies. I was honestly a little bit hesitant when I saw this hero basically pop on the Fantasy Flight website. I thought it was some sort of joke. I think it was roughly around April Fool's when they put this thing out. So I was kind of like, haha. And so then I was a little bit hesitant to see, oh yeah, they actually made this card pack. So I went into it with a little bit of pessimism, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. And so was one of the other players at the game table. She actually said, yeah, she would play Spider-Ham again, and actually enjoyed it, specifically using the protection aspect. So I think that was a little bit surprising, so that your veteran players that played a lot of this game, a couple of them were actually like, yeah, this is pretty cool. It's a little bit on the cheesy side. I do think the deck is really well suited for a young player, so maybe like an elementary school or junior high school kid could probably learn this pretty well. I want to thank you all for joining me today, and as always, have fun gaming.